This is TEDxOshkosh TV, a complimentary extra to the annual TEDxOshkosh in-person event. In each episode of the show, we'll learn more about a past TEDxOshkosh speaker, how their talk idea is spread, and the change it has inspired.
Hi, I'm Grace Lim. Welcome to TEDxOshkosh TV. I'm your host. Today we're joined by Caitlin Looby, a scientist turned journalist who covers the Great Lakes for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Before becoming a reporter, she spent more than a decade hiking cloud forests, studying microbes, soil, and climate change. In her 2023 TEDxOshkosh talk, Rebuilding or Building Public Trust in Science, Caitlin shares why science needs to move beyond big sweeping views and meet people where they are, connecting through local stories, community engagement, and collaboration between scientists and journalists. Before we meet our guests, here's a short clip from her talk.
The best way to connect and rebuild public trust in science is to head back into the cloud forest and focus on something like the hot pink mushroom growing out of a log, the bird calls cutting through the wind, or the frogs jumping on and off the trail.
Caitlin, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is very exciting because I loved your talk. To start off, just tell us what made you decide to give this particular talk.
Yeah, I think for the past decade or so, people have really been thinking and focusing a lot about science communication and what that means and what the role that scientists and academics should have in communicating with the public and politicians. And, we've seen with the COVID pandemic that, it's very easy for misinformation or disinformation to get put out there, and people, they want information. Sometimes they're just confused about where to get it and who to trust. And I think that goes with a lot of different topics too, like with climate change and all sorts of public health issues. So I think it was really important just to talk about different ways that scientists and academia can do better, how journalists can do better. We can all just work a little bit better together to help rebuild public trust in science and to get people back on the side of making sure that factual information is what's getting out there.
Oh, I'm all for that. So, let's take a step back and talk about your background. I mean, you have a very impressive background. You are a science reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. You have multiple degrees in science fields, including a doctorate in biology. So how do you answer the question when you're, like at a party and somebody says, "Hey, what do you do?" I mean, for work. So how would you answer that?
Yeah, of course, since I'm very much doing journalism now, that's okay. But I also add the little caveat in there that I am a scientist turned journalist, because I think it really shapes what kind of stories I tell, how I tell them, how I should be interacting with the public. So I kind of talk about, that transition and why it was so important for me to enter more of a science communication as somebody who has an expertise in science and knows what it looks like, how much of a pain in the butt it can be, and kind of use that in order to inform a lot of my reporting and kinds of stories that I.
These days on Instagram and TikTok, you get influencers talking science. What is your take on that?
I think it really depends. I don't have any broad sweeping view saying that, thinking that science influencers are bad. Some are doing a really great job getting information out there. And, anytime you can get science information out there to people in a way that is interesting, kind of piques their curiosity and helps improve science literacy, I'm all for it, as long as it's factual information that, is based on evidence, which I think there are some science influencers out there, they're doing it. And to be honest, a a lot of people, they're getting their information these days from social media. So you shouldn't be working so hard against it, because like that's a great way to meet people where they're at and meet all sorts of audiences too. It's not always like, you're not going to find a 15-year-old probably picking up a print newspaper and reading it. So if you want to hit all different audiences, you have to kind of meet them where they're at.
You're right. I've seen MDs and PhDs and people talking about being an astronaut on social media. So back to your TEDx talk. You opened with a really vivid scene from cloud forest in Costa Rica, where you did a lot of your research. What made you decide to open with that?
Yeah, I'm very much just I try to approach science communication and all of my reporting too from, the lens of a storyteller. You have to get people invested in what you're saying. And the best way to do that is to, put people in the same place you are, show them what you see, show them what you heard, and really just kind of grab their attention and get them invested. And, for me, thankfully, it's really easy to do that, talking about cloud forests. And, a lot of people haven't seen cloud forests, but they are a very unique ecosystem that it's easy to describe. And also at the same time, too, they're a place that scientifically climate change is happening very fast in a way it's kind of even observable. I saw a lot of changes over the course of my going there for 10 years. So in terms of what birds are, where they're supposed to be, like what kinds of amphibians are still there or not there. And even just talking about the forest floor being so dry sometimes that it was cracked. You can describe these things to people in a way that they can see it, they can feel it, and they get invested in it. And, when it comes to science communication or science reporting, I always just feel that it's story first and science second. And you always just use your science to support your story, because people care about humans and experiences, and kind of that's the best way to get people on board when it comes to any sort of data or other information you're going to later throw at them.
Oh, I totally get that. I mean, when people start throwing numbers at me right from the get-go, it turns to just sort of dissolve into I don't know what. But when I hear a story about you're talking about focus on the mushroom. You argue that scientists need to move away from these big sweeping global announcements or perspectives and focus on the mushroom. What do you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think there's a little bit of a thought, at least in academia and for a lot of scientists. Fortunately, I think it's changing, but this idea that, you want to publish these really big papers that get the attention of national news, that they cover a lot of global information, which I think is all really great. But I think scientists, by and large, are missing a lot of opportunities by not localizing their research and by really just trying to connect with the communities that they live in, or the communities that they do their research, because there's, especially when it comes to something like climate change, there's not one big global change that's happening. There's lots of different changes that are happening in different ways, and in different ways that people are experiencing. So you can't really build a trust with people if you're talking about something that they don't understand and they can't see or hear or smell or what have you. You need to meet them where they're at and talk about things that are right in front of them. So I think it's really important for scientists, of course, to merge all these big data sets and make some statements about larger global patterns. But I think it's really important not to kind of look past doing more local things too, and kind of understand these smaller changes that are happening.
So the erosion of trust in science. I mean, where do you think that? How did that happen?
I'm not really sure. There's lots of different things that probably contributed to it. I think, the internet has been great, and it's also been kind of not great in another way, that information can spread really fast, and a lot of times that can be the wrong information. And I think also too that, people often want to hear things that's within their worldview, which is a great way for misinformation to spread, especially like if you see groups on Facebook spreading like information that's either wrong or just like an AI generated image. I think it's really easy for people just to want to think about what's comfortable for them, and then kind of anything else that may, they have to think a little bit harder about or be a little bit more curious about. I think that can be really scary for people. I recently wrote an article talking a little bit more about this, that like, when you're growing up, science is the cool topic. It's the one where you're learning about astronauts and the moon and eclipses and dinosaurs, and like kids are just really stoked on it. And then at some point, it kind of becomes about grades and doing well, and it gets a little bit harder. And that curiosity that like is what brings kids into science, that kind of, gets beat out of you a little bit as you go up in school. And I think like that also plays a role. And, I think also just scientists sometimes not being great about communicating their science, and also the media not always getting information right, or, kind of creating situations where people think, for instance, that like climate change, discrepancy is kind of bigger than it is. And I think there's just lots of things that have contributed kind of eroding away that trust.
So you are both. I mean, you are a scientist and a journalist. I mean, what do you do to bridge the two? Because I think you had said that, they're both seeking answers to society's questions. So how do you do that?
Yeah, like I mentioned in my talk, I always say, and I said this too in my classes when I taught science communication, that, scientists and journalists really are doing the exact same thing. They're trying to answer questions that are really important to help out the public. They just work at very different timescales. As a reporter, sometimes I may bust out a story in 20 minutes in my car, and then, it took me 5 years to complete a PhD. But like essentially, they're doing the same exact thing. And I think it's like really important to kind of note that similarity. And that's something that I kind of try and do when I talk to scientists about like journalism and whatnot, and what stories I'm trying to tell. And I think as a journalist too, I use my scientist lens to make sure that, I'm telling interesting stories, but also ones that are based on studies coming out of good journals and make sense. And if it's like a report that's come out from a really biased organization, like I'm probably not going to report on that. Or if I report on it, I'm going to do it in a way where like I note that information is coming from a source that, may have some biases. And I think it's just really important in building trust, like not only between scientists and the public, and journalists and the public, and also both science and journalists together, that you just be open and honest about what you're doing, just to kind of like bridge those lines of communication.
In the climate these days, your talk is incredibly relevant. I mean, have you received feedback since you've given the talk?
I have, yeah. I've had a number of folks reach out to me, like not only readers, but I've also, I got approached by some folks in the UK about like writing an article having to do my talk, and I've, been on some radio shows about it. I think, it's really interesting for people to hear from somebody that like, has this dual career, where I kind of like sat in both seats, and I have this unique perspective about, how science works and how journalism works, and, how everyone can kind of do better, myself included. And I think that's, why it's so important that scientists now, not just me, but a number of folks are getting into journalism and bringing their expertise to the industry.
how different was preparing for the TEDx talk to say any other presentation that you've given?
I would say pretty different because, it was mostly memorized. When I was in graduate school, I gave a 3-minute thesis talk, which is kind of structured like a mini TED talk. But that was 3 minutes, and that was something that I memorized and basically described my entire dissertation work in 3 minutes, which it was helpful in terms of learning the structure, but I would say it was pretty different than any other thing that I've done before. I was spending a lot of time in my living room with my dogs, going over my talk over and over again, and in the car, going on little weekend trips, just kind of like using any bit of that time to kind of like go over my talk and tweak it.
And on the day of, was there something that you would have wanted to do differently looking back?
I don't think so. I am not somebody who is usually good at being present and being in the moments, but I talked with some folks before about like making sure to actually enjoy the day and enjoy the experience and just have it be about the talk, but have it be about like this opportunity that you have to share your knowledge with people. So I really tried to stay present as much as possible and focus on having fun, which is not something that like I'm usually good at under high pressure situations. But I think I actually did a good job that day, even though it was really challenging because I think I was the third to last person to go. So I spent a lot of time in the basement, like just listening to music or going over my talk and just trying to like trying to keep the nerves down.
Sure. When you were on stage though, did you relax, or was it hard looking out in the audience? Describe that.
I did relax. I think I was a lot more relaxed than I thought I was going to be. Somebody had mentioned to me that like before that when you go out there, like you don't really see a lot of audience members because of the lights, which is something I didn't really understand until I actually got there and like, got on the red dots and then saw that like, oh, I couldn't really see a lot of people, which I think was actually really helpful because it was very much kind of like practicing in the middle of the night in my living room, staring at the wall. So I kind of just like thought about, it's just like being in your living room and just like focusing on the fact that like, all those people were there and whoever ends up listening online, they all are getting an opportunity to hear what I have to say. And that's absolutely just a huge privilege.
Awesome. And afterwards, how did were you able to mingle with some of the audience members or and get any feedback?
Yeah, I did. I actually had a lot of students come up to me, undergraduate students and graduate students that I connected with afterwards that, were interested in science communication, wanted to know more about career paths and whatnot. So I thought that was really, really rewarding just to try and like, help other students that are interested in this career path get into it. Because, once you get on the academic pipeline, it can be really hard to figure out how to do other things besides research, because usually that's all that like your advisor knows how to do because that's, that was their career path. So I think it's, a privilege to be in a position where I can help other students kind of like find where they want to be in science and how to contribute their science expertise to the public.
What advice would you give to people who think they might want to give a TEDx talk?
I would say very much just look at it in terms of being a really great opportunity and a privilege to share knowledge, and also just a great learning experience too. It was a huge challenge, not only constructing that talk, but going through edits and then also learning it. I would say it sounds a little cliche, but the journey of that experience I found really, really rewarding. And I would just think about the experience, not so much about the end point, but about the process of getting to that end point. And in a lot of ways, it probably isn't going to be an end point, because it's going to spark conversations and maybe open up opportunities to continue that conversation outside of where it lives on YouTube.
Was your talk longer than it ended up being, or shorter? I mean, did you expand it?
I think my talk stayed pretty true to the length, and I would say it ended up going a little bit longer than I thought it was going to, but I think that was also a factor of the fact that I was a lot more relaxed than I thought I was going to be, and I didn't go into my East Coast mode of just talking really fast and trying to get through it. Like, I really did feel relaxed in that moment and was able to talk a little bit more clearly and slowly.
You mentioned that you actually went through some edits. I mean, you're a writer. Did you go through a couple drafts before you decided this is it?
I went through a couple drafts, and it was great because we had, not only folks look after edits, but we also had a mentor too that helped. I am somebody, I definitely, probably got a little too close to the deadlines, but there was a lot of trust built in there that I'm a journalist and my life is about deadlines, and I don't tend to miss them, but sometimes I do get a little close to them. But I think I'm just someone too that my first draft is usually pretty clean, and then I'm open to opportunities to fix and to change things. And it was really great to have so many eyes on my talk before I actually ended up, being in a position where I wanted to learn my talk, just because, the more opinions, the better off it's going to end up being received by the audience.
Past speakers have said that, doing it was rather terrifying. And was it like that for you? And any regrets?
I wasn't really terrified. I think, there was advice that my advisor gave me when I was going through my PhD, and I was a grad student giving talks to all these like big wigs in a room, or even at like the moment when I was giving my dissertation talk, just the realization that like nobody knows the material that you're going to talk about more than you do. So you are the expert in the room, and just trying to remind yourself of that people may have thoughts, they may have different opinions, but nobody knows it better than you, and just kind of using that to maintain your confidence.
Great. And finally, for people watching this, what is one small action they could take to better engage with science and rebuild trust, in their own communities?
Yeah, I would say for anybody, out there who's not a scientist or a journalist, just somebody who's a consumer, I think it's important to consume media in a way that, is healthy for you. Sometimes, reading the news for 8 hours a day is not great for everyone, but consuming the media in a way that's healthy for you, consuming media that is actually factually correct, and even sometimes like media that may differ a little bit from your opinions, but is still factually correct. And I think it's important to just be engaged and, know what's going on out there. Make sure you're not just reading headlines, but you're reading some of the material too, and just make sure that you're open to hearing things that may not completely align with your worldview, but are going to make you a more curious person in the end.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us your experiences and your passion. And I'm Grace Slim, and you've been watching TEDxOshkosh TV.
Visit TEDxOshkosh.com to view the complete talks of all past TEDxOshkosh speakers, as well as more episodes of TEDxOshkosh TV.